Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to another Ummatics colloquium. It gives me great pleasure to return after several months in transition, as it were, because I have recently relocated. And my name is Usama Al-A'zami. I'm now an assistant professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Islamic Studies. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest for this evening or this morning, as the case may be, wherever you are, Dr. Osman Umarji, a very dear friend and colleague who has also relatively recently relocated to the country of Qatar. So we're both actually zooming out, so to speak, from Qatar. And in keeping with his very broad-ranging experience, he'll be talking today, inshallah, about raising Ummatic children, the parenting challenge. And so building a unified and thriving Ummah begins with the upbringing of Ummatic children. To develop a mature Muslim identity capable of navigating life through an Ummatic lens, it is essential to instill elements such as a strong faith, moral integrity, and the ability to shift from a self-centered perspective to one that embraces the interests and well-being of the entire Ummah. Parents play a key role in this process. This colloquium thus examines what constitutes an Ummatic child, identifying the key elements essential to developing mature Muslim identity. And given the present-day tarbiyah challenges, we also delve into practical methods and strategies that parents can employ to nurture the Ummatic identity of their children. This discourse is crucial for understanding the role of familial upbringing in fostering cohesive and prosperous Ummah. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Osman Omarji, who is a scholar of Islam and of educational pedagogy. He studied at Al-Azhar University in Cairo in Egypt and also received his PhD in education from the University of California at Irvine. He is currently the Director of Survey Research and Evaluation at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, the context in which I first got to know Dr. Osman. And he is a seasoned religious scholar and developmental scientist with an interest in researching the intersection of religion, psychology, and education. His areas of expertise include development of religiosity, human motivation, and decision-making. Inshallah, we look forward to having a discussion for the next, I guess, 20 to 30 minutes. And then I look forward to opening up a broader organic discussion with yourself, Dr. Osman. But we always like to engage our audience members, so we strongly encourage audience members to write into the chat, which you should have access to on YouTube. Write into the YouTube chat any questions you have, any comments you have, and where possible, I will incorporate them into our discussion. I'll ask the questions of Dr. Osman, so this is a wonderful opportunity to put your questions to an expert in the field, and I'll also share your comments where they are pertinent. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Osman to speak about raising Ummatic children, the parenting challenge. فليتفضل. بسم الله.
الله يبارك فيك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه من والاه. Jazakum khair, Dr. Osama, for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to be amongst yourself and the esteemed Ummatics community. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to put barakah in this initiative and to unite the Ummah. Ameen. So I'll begin my conversation today. I have a short presentation we can quickly go through, but I like the back and forth. And for me, I want to start our conversation with a gathering that Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was having with some of the Sahaba. And they were sitting in a house. And like we all do sometimes, we have gatherings and dinner parties, whatever else it might be. And he just asked those companions, he's the Khalifa at this time, and he says, why don't you guys, someone make a wish for something grand. Right? And one of the companions, he says, I wish that this room, this house, is filled with gold, so I can spend that for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. And if you think about it, that's actually, if you were asked to someone just make a wish, the fact that this individual, this Sahabi, is thinking about wealth for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the ummah is a tremendous, like, just a proof of just how ummatic, right, and how central thinking about the ummah was for the companions, right? But Sayyidina Umar, radiallahu anh, he was not satisfied with this response, right? And he asked them, someone else make a wish, right? He was looking for something more grand. And someone else said something similar. Okay, it's not gold, let's fill it with jewels and pearls and diamonds and all kinds of wealth. Again, for the sake of spending it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, Umar, not satisfied. And they said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, we don't know what to wish for. Tell us, what do you want? And that's when he says, his famous statement, where he said that I wish that this house, right, was full of men like Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, right, Salim, right, the Mawla Abu Hudayfa, and I wanted people like this to use them to spread the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want to begin with a story because I think so many times when we are here to think about the challenges of the ummah, or the opportunities of the ummah, right, and the establishment of Islam in the world, and the establishment of Islamic political unity, so many times people think at the level of, we need more resources, right? We need more money, right? We need a larger endowment, right? We need a land, right? We need places, right? And it's all kinds of material resources that we spend our time thinking about. And I think some of that speaks to the fact that we are, many of us in the Muslim world, whether we realize it or not, we have been indoctrinated with this idea of materialism, right? That it's the material world that possesses the elements, that it's not even about the self, right? In this case, it's not about, I want the money for myself, I want the wealth, but even this belief that without those material resources, that's the prerequisite essentially. And for us, again, it's important to note that we have the resources, right? It's not a lack of money in the ummah that is holding us back from political unity. It's not the lack of having lands and countries and nations, right? We have all that. Almost anything material that the ummah needs, even intelligence and skill sets and talents, all of that we have in abundance. What we are fundamentally lacking are individuals, like Sayyidina Umar understood, radiallahu anh, who really you can use to change the world, right? People who have that ability, right? Who are worth so much more than one person. And they always say this all the time, what can you do? You're one person. And this is not an Islamic concept. And I want the parents who are here listening to reflect over that our children that we're working so hard to raise as good Muslims, don't think about them as only, 1 out of a billion or 1 out of, 2 billion Muslims who are in the world. And that's another example of that is when Umar ibn Khattab, right, when he was asked by Amr ibn As, when he was in Egypt, he said, please send me, like I need a lot of soldiers, right? And so he sends him 4, right? I've sent you the equivalent of 4,000 men. Each of them is equal to, right, 1,000, right? And he sends Zubair ibn Awam and Miqdad and Ubadah and Maslama. And the point again is that Umar recognized that the value of raising one person who has the skill and the talent and the ability to serve the ummah is far greater, right, than the thousands and thousands and thousands of even righteous, pious people who are not activated, right, who are maybe, good practicing Muslims and members of the ummah, but they're not the ones who are contributing back and have the skills, the quwwah, the strength, as Ibn Taymiyyah speaks about, and the amana to do these things. And so I want to double down on this today and really make this like the premise of what I want to speak about, is that I want every parent to realize and aspire to, I want to raise my child to be one who is worth thousands and thousands and thousands, right? And the same thing, by the way, applies with our wealth, not to take it too far away, but again, our dollar, your dollar, my dollar, inshallah, is worth thousands and thousands of dollars that come from the kuffar, right? That come from those who are the enemies of Islam, because we have barakah in what we have. And so doubling down on this issue of what are parents supposed to do, that's the goal of this, right? How is a parent supposed to approach this and raise somebody who's worth 1,000, or raise someone who can spread the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal and unite the Muslim Ummah? We start with the issue of adolescence, right? And of course, we can speak a lot today about parenting in general and religious parenting, and there's a whole lot of literature on that. I don't want to spend way too much time on that today, but we'll overlap some topics. But I want to start with this idea of a good Muslim child. Ideally, we hope that when he's little, right, from infancy to the early years, we're doing our best to do whatever it takes to get them the right Islamic education. And mashallah, you guys have had wonderful experts previously speaking about Islamic education and schooling. So I will leave that for a minute. And I'll focus on this issue of what actually is a young Muslim adolescent going through, and what do the parents need to be doing during this phase of life. That's what I'm going to focus my talk on today for the next 15, 20 minutes. And as most psychologists and even Islamic thinkers speak about, Ibn Jawzi and others actually reference the same topic that, again, only modern psychology has identified in the last 50 years, that the crisis of the youth, the crisis of adolescence, fundamentally is about defining who they are. They are trying to figure out, what is my place in this world? Who am I trying to be? What group am I a part of? Where am I situating myself in this universe? And ultimately, they're trying to do two things that are actually polar opposites, but at the exact same time. They are trying to figure out, how do I fit into this world that I'm in? And how do I stand out in the world at the same time? I want to repeat that again. It's really important. A youth is trying to figure out, how do I fit into the world that I'm in, my community, my country, maybe the Umma, whatever it might be, and how do I stand out as well? How am I unique? And these things are happening simultaneously. And from a Muslim perspective, so many Muslim parents, especially in the West, and I want to kind of compartmentalize that for a minute, sometimes the aspirations are incredibly low because of the pressure of just simply being a Muslim can be so overwhelming that I know many Muslim parents who are good practicing parents who are just like, I just want my kid to say, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Right? That's the threshold now we've set because of the amount of pressure we're seeing, right? And the amount of shubuhat and, and leaving Islam and so on and so forth. So that's not what we want, right? We don't want to set this bar very, very low. At the same time, we don't want them to be just, again, from a Western individualistic perspective, an individually practicing Muslim. And that, again, is what so many good religious parents, they focus on. They say, you know what, the society around me is really problematic, right? There's a lot of bad things. I need to insulate my child, raise him or her to be good at Quran. Their tilawah is beautiful. Their salawat are very good. Their siyam is excellent, right? Their education is very, top notch, all in the service of essentially succeeding in the dunya, right? We want them to succeed in the dunya while having the Islamic check boxes done. And that's why even better parents will say, I want to put my kid in a Hifz program or something like that. But that's actually not how the Quran thinks about us raising our children. And it's not how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about what is the ideal of a Muslim. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Fussilat, the beautiful ayah, so, وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا. And the most important part, وَقَالَ إِنَّنِي مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. Right? It's so central, right, that the best of people in speech are the ones who are engaged in da'wah, right? Those who do righteous deeds, and they say, indeed, I am of the Muslims. This collective identity is a central component of raising a successful child, of raising an Ummatic child. All right. And again, I want to say this because so many times those Muslim kids who grow up successful in every sense, they become doctors, they become lawyers, they become tech barons, they become whatever it is that is worldly success. And they have millions of dollars and they have influence in society. And I was just hearing this both in the UK context and the American context. We have a lot of examples about how many millionaires are in the UK. I was speaking to a brother in a very prominent nonprofit, but who don't want to give wealth to the Ummah, not because they're stingy, because they're scared that the Daily Mail is going to come after them essentially if it gets found out and their career comes to an end, right? So here it's like their Islam is undercover. And someone just asked me the same question the other day. They said, are there any American Muslims who are worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars? And we said, of course there are. But many of them keep their Islam very down low, right? And the key issue here is they don't want it publicly known because they're going to get attacked, right? And that's the end of their career. So, mashallah, they pray 5 times a day, they perform Umrah, right? They go for Hajj, they do all the right things on that regard, but they're not activated ummatically. So for us as good parents, I want us to have this kind of as like as maybe like a slogan that you work with, right? Or as an aim and an objective when you evaluate your kids' outcomes or you evaluate your own parenting, is does my son or daughter fundamentally identify as a member of this ummah? And I don't mean that like lip service wise. You can say it cognitively, right? Yeah, I'm a member of the ummah. But I'm talking about, is it something they deeply, deeply believe in? They have internalized, they enjoy, they take pride in. And that's why I go back to this idea, the fundamental need to belong exists in every human being. And parents have to realize that their child will find belonging somewhere. And if it's not going to be with the ummah, it's going to be with their nationality. If it's not with their nationality, it's going to be with their ethnic race. If it's not with their ethnic race, it's going to be with their gender group. It's going to be with something that gives them a place to say, I'm part of something greater than myself. That's the part about fitting in. I fit into something. I belong to it. It gives to me. I give back to it. And That's where I'll pivot and talk about, all these different things are happening to a child simultaneously. Again, context specific. But yeah, our children are growing up trying to figure out, what does it mean for me to be, an Arab in the West, right? Or a Desi, or whatever other background you come from, right? What is my ethnic identity? How do I understand it? Am I self-hating? Am I proud of it? Do I think that makes me superior? Do I want people to know that I come from this ethnic background? Do I want to suppress it? And that, again, extends to other things. They think about their gender. What does it mean to be a male in the modern world or a female in the modern world, right? How do I adopt a sense of masculinity or femininity, right? These are all things that they're negotiating every single day. And social media, schools, technology, movies, all of these are shaping these identities, right? And you can, of course, central to our conversation today is this is a concept, whether or not they are developing an Islamic identity as being a member of the Ummah. And that's why I want to highlight this. It's not just I'm a Muslim, but it's I am a member of this Ummah. And where does that membership fall into their identity hierarchies, right? We'll get to that. It could be social class. Am I rich? Am I poor? Am I middle class? Of course, we know that affects your behavior, right? It could be your political identity. If you're from the US, of course, Democrat, Republican, right? If you're from the UK, whether you're labor, reform, all these things. Whether or not you see yourself as someone who's driven by, are you a capitalist? Do you adopt that worldview? And by the way, these are happening subconsciously, right? The teenager is not saying, let me negotiate my capitalist identity or my political identity. They're just processes that are working at them that they're constantly having to engage with because people talk to them and they have to activate their behaviors in different contexts, right? And then, of course, it could be their national identity. Am I an American? Am I a Brit, right? Am I whatever country I come from, right? Whether it's from the Muslim world or not. Now, while all of this is happening at this exact same time, sometimes what we fail to recognize is that this is not just parallel. Right? These are not things happening at the same time, but they all reside equally within our children or even within us. Ultimately, what ends up happening is depending on how we've been socialized, how successful the internalization of these identities is, these all stack within ourselves either at a higher or lower level. So, and again, they can be turned on in certain contexts, but just to give you an example, you might see one Muslim kid and he's being raised and this is how he comes out. He grows up and he's now a young adult. And he's like, I'm an American first and foremost, or I'm a Brit first and foremost. That is what identifies who I am. It reflects in how I dress. It reflects in how I talk. It reflects in some of the other tastes and sensibilities that I have. Maybe second comes my racial identity. Okay, I'm a Pakistani American, right? Or I'm a Bengali Brit, right? Or I'm a Moroccan, Brit. That's maybe secondary, right? And then the point here is that all these things are stacking, and you're trying to figure out, for this kid in this example, their Islamic identity, you can see, is kind of in the middle, right? Which is important when you think about behavior. If you think about behavior and when you have value conflicts, which always happen in life, someone is going to resolve a value conflict through the identity that is most prominent to them, right? And you think about that in any context, it makes sense, right? If we take another example, you might have a person who grows up. It's like, no, I am first and foremost, and I will say this openly, many American Muslims have suffered from this. Political identity, alhamdulillah, up until probably the last year and a half, was so strong that it actually superseded almost every other aspect of who they are, right? So being a Democrat, right, comes first and foremost. Maybe then I'm like a doctor and I'm part of this elite kind of, highly educated community, so on and so forth, right? And the Ummatic sentiments were incredibly low. It doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that they're very low and they get expressed in ways that are actually sometimes very disturbing. Like you'll see people who might say things like, the Muslim Ummah is all messed up, but we, like American Muslims or British Muslims, like we know what we're doing. And, my party, right, like we have a better handle on the world. And if people were to listen to us, they would succeed, right? And by that's not a hypothetical. That's literally what some people do say, right? And then, of course, I think in a more ideal sense is that you hope that a kid internalizes that the Ummatic Islamic identity is first and foremost. It supersedes any other sense of who they are. Yeah, okay, I might be Pakistani, right? I might be, I might be Qatari, right? Whatever I am, that's way further down the road. My loyalty, my wala, right, and my is to the Muslim Ummah, right? And then everything else comes next. Whether I'm a male and I'm masculine and I'm a professor or a whatever, that makes no difference. But the point I want to highlight here is that this is what we're here to speak about today. We're here to understand what are the factors that might help a kid become what we want, is that Ummatic Islamic identity first, ensure that it's not at the bottom, And often realistically, sometimes these end up somewhere in the middle, again, all due to socialization. And that's what we'll speak a little bit in the next few minutes about what are the forces that ultimately cause this to happen, right? What are the reasons that someone either becomes more Umatic or less Umatic or more politically, thinking about themselves. And this is a very this is simplifying it, but the Umatic socialization process essentially is you have an individual, a child who's growing up in a household, and that household every day is sending images and sending signals to this kid about who they're supposed to be, right? I remember when I was growing up, sometimes my parents would say things like, "Hey, you're we're Pakistani, and this is why we do this," right? And sometimes that was used in the service actually of doing good things, right? I mean, you might think of an example that someone is some youth are, let's say, drinking alcohol as an example, right? And your parents say, "Hey, don't forget you're Pakistani. We don't do that," right? It's true. It's true that Pakistanis shouldn't do that, right? But what they meant to say perhaps was like, Muslims don't do that. But you could clearly see that from their perspective, they were kind of meshing these things together. But the kid is picking up on that, right? The kid is picking up. It's that this ethnic or racial or national identity is really, really important. I have to think about it, right? So again, the key thing here is that that concentric circle, that we're all nested in these environments. And no matter what you do with your kids, whether your kids go to Islamic school, private school, homeschool, public school, these processes work the same way. It's that home is going to be, right, the central and most potent source of where kids pick up on their values, their beliefs, and their behaviors. That's the reality of it across the board. The second layer to think about is maybe their neighborhood, right, and their broader community. That can include your masjid, include your schools, includes all the other elements of one's neighborhood. And by the way, that is important because there are little symbols that could be out there. Something as simple as, alhamdulillah, we're here in the Muslim world right now, and we are listening to the adhan go off, right? That's in my neighborhood, right? My neighborhood is, 100 yards around me is there's a masjid calling the adhan. That is trickling into my sense of who I am, right? My kids cannot forget salah 5 times a day, right? Whether or not they pray is a separate issue, but it's an input, right? And then the furthest concentric circle would here be the society and the cultural influence, essentially, right? That everyone is trickling these ideas down through media, right? Through social media, right? Through movies, through games, through ideas that exist in the air that sometimes people can't even grasp. I'll give an example of this. I give a very American example. I was just speaking the other day to some folks. This notion of the American dream, right? What does that mean? Right, the American dream is this, very ambiguous term that refers to a whole bunch of things that you don't really get taught like explicitly, but they're in the air, right? They get passed off in conversation, and that means that if you work hard and you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can make it to the top, right? That we're a country of immigrants, right? That that there's a meritocracy and all kinds of other elements that are captured in this notion that the poorest person can become a millionaire or a billionaire. But that is what I mean. That is an ideal that's trickling in, and a parent will pick up on it and tell the kid, "Hey, it doesn't matter where you come from. You can live the American dream. You can own a home. You can buy a car, right? Whatever it might be." So I want to come back to then say, so the Muslim parent ultimately will be the strongest influence, but they will not be the only influence. But what the Muslim parent is they are the gatekeeper of how those other influences come into the kid's life and how they negotiate them. So you cannot stop those other factors, but you have to then engage with them. So again, dealing with technology, right? Dealing with a neighborhood, right? Dealing with a greater society. Say, okay, you know what? I recognize we live in a place that has different values. How do we understand those values? So can we accept the American dream? Can that be a value that you hold, right? Can we internalize an American identity? What does that look like? These are all things that we negotiate, right? But I'll come back now to the key issue, and I'll stop on the slide, is that for the parent to kind of have we said we want to give people practical steps, a blueprint, right? What does it take? What are some of the ingredients? And I'll just go through 4 of these today. The first and foremost that we have to speak about is that the parent who wants their kids to think about the Ummah first and foremost has to model that in their own behavior. It's cliche at this point to say it, but it is incredibly true, and all research supports this, that when a child sees their parents doing certain behaviors and they like their parents, that's a really important point I want to make here, that people forget that second part. They think that if I just do it, my kid will copy. But actually, if your children don't like you, they will actually not imitate some of the behaviors you want them to imitate. And that's maybe a topic for another conversation. Maybe we can come back to that in our Q&A. But if a child and a parent have a strong bond, it's at that point that when the parent enacts these type of behaviors. What do I mean by this? Does the child look at the parent and say that parent thinks about the ummah all the time, right? Their loyalty is to the ummah. I see it in their behavior. I see it in their words. Look, my dad was willing to go and do something for the ummah, despite the fact that it was at a cost to himself or our family, right? My father or my mother, I saw them crying because they saw stuff about what's happening in Gaza, right? They have tears for the ummah, right? They have tears when they see what's happening in Sudan, tears for what's happening in Syria, or joy when good things happen. They're happy when good things happen to them. Those are all little data points that the kid is collecting, right, over decades and decades and decades, and trying to figure out what is it my parent cares about, right? Or is it the opposite, where, my parents don't really care about what's happening in the ummah, but if it's about our national or ethnic identity, then they're totally plugged in, right? So again, sorry to give a crude example, right? But you might have people who were ignoring Palestine for the last, almost 2 years, right? And then a little bit of stuff happens between, India and Pakistan, and all of a sudden they're all politically active, right? Well, it means your loyalty might have been only to your country in this case, right? Which again, it's not to say that that's all bad, right? But it's showing the imbalance here. And the kid is going to pick up, my parents' sensibilities are not ummah focused, right? Another little example, right? When we're giving sadaqah, I remember many times people would say that they would want to send their sadaqah always back to their home country. And there's value in that, without a doubt. And that's because there's sense of blood ties there as well, if they're relatives, extended relatives, and it's part of our fiqh, it's part of our tradition. But do they see, for instance, the parents spending money on the rest of the ummah as well? Is udhiyah going to parts of the world, right, that are incredibly poor, but that they have no other affiliation to other than the fact that they're Muslims, right? So role modeling is one huge part of it, right? The second part of it, and we can spend a little bit of time on this, is that your parents inculcate the mindset in the child. This is something very, very deliberate, right? It's not random. Is that this is a goal-driven behavior. I want my kid to think about the ummah in a very positive light, right? I want to build that mindset that he wants to belong to this group because this group is worthy of belonging to, and I motivate him or her, right, to engage with it. What do I mean by that? SubhanAllah, again, it's part of the world we live in, where we just have been born into an era where Muslims are low on the totem pole in terms of right now political power, right? And for that reason, sometimes it gets people really, really down. We see the weakness of the ummah, but be careful about transmitting this to your children in a way that will make them feel no agency to change things. That, the Western world has all the power, right? The Muslim world has no power. We don't have our act together. We can't accomplish anything, right? And even if you think that that is somewhat true, perception is sometimes more important than the reality. It's really, really important we understand that, right? And you think about the Prophet ﷺ when he's in, Khandaq, right? The reality is, right, things are pretty bad at the moment, and they're being attacked, and they're hungry, and they're starving, and the situation couldn't look more grim. But what is the Prophet ﷺ doing? He's like, I see how weak you feel right now. I see how scared you are right now. I'm going to give you bishara about the future. Giving your kids the bishara, right, and this idea that the ummah will succeed and is succeeding in many, many ways, right? It's about framing. And you come back to all these hadith. How many hadith and ayat give this notion, right, about the ummah, about its success, about its value, right? Even the ayah, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas, right? Like, do children absorb and get told by their parents to have a sense of ummatic exceptionalism, that the Muslim ummah is the best? You have to believe that. You have to believe it, and you have to tell that to your kids. Allah tells us in the Quran, you were the best ummah raised for mankind. Why? Because you command that which is good, right, and you forbid that which is evil. But my point here is that, is it a deliberate kind of a measurement? What does my kid think about the ummah? How do I keep making him think better and better and better about it? Of course, this is theoretically right now. We haven't got to the behavioral side of it, right? And this is using the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's using the ayat of the Quran. And then what I'll move to, the last two, I think we can talk about these together, is this parent-child coactivity is a big part of it, but it falls typically under these, what I call providing Omatic resources and experiences. And this is probably where we'll spend most of our discussion, I hope, today, which is, this is not an intellectual exercise. This is not sitting in a classroom and telling the kids, you know what, we have to be, Umatic Muslims. Here's some hadith and here's some ayat. Now you're an Umatic Muslim. This is actually an issue of the heart. This is an issue of building the memories and the experiences that make this something that you want to internalize. And for Western Muslims, this is actually really, really difficult, often because we're just so disconnected from this. So what do I mean by Ummatic resources and experiences? A couple of things. So one is the ability to connect with the Ummah, right? There's some resources that are required. One of those is language resources. Do we think about giving our kids the linguistic ability to engage with the extended Ummah? I know American Muslims in particular are really suffer in this, right? Really suffer because we're geographically far away, and there are not good mechanisms to teach our kids these languages, and they're losing languages, right? Whether it be your ethnic language or otherwise. But I tell this to my kids, as we've recently moved here, that the English Muslim population is 300 million or so? I believe that's been said, right? Now, if you want to speak to the Ummah, for the most part, when Muslims go overseas as tourists, you're engaging with a very different strata of that society. And I, someone who's lived in Egypt for years and loves Egypt with all my dear heart. If you go as a tourist and you only speak English, many times you're going to have a very, very negative experience because you're going to deal with people who are trying to rip you off, right? Or vice versa in any other country, because that's a certain segment of the tourism industry, right? It does not represent the reality of the society, right? But I tell my kids all the time, I said, look, because alhamdulillah, we can speak different languages, I can access the Arabic-speaking Muslim world, right? Or the Urdu or the Hindi-speaking Muslim world. And that's actually, now we're talking about billions and billions of people, which gives you the ability to interact with people in a very different way. And, we'll come back to that in a few minutes, but that's I want to really just make sure language is something which parents don't think is something that is extracurricular or something which is a nice to have. I would actually argue that perhaps it's one of the most important abilities or skills your kids have to develop if they want to become Ummatic, because it's going to not only allow them to literally communicate with Muslims, but actually access information. For those of us, again, stuck with English, the search engines are also rigged against us. So when you Google any topic, you're getting not only stuff in English, but that a certain Western, corporation or powers want you to see, right? So whether it be you're looking up, what is going on in Gaza, what's going on anywhere else in the world, it's very hard to get out of that bubble if you're only being able to access in the English language. That's contemporary news, let alone, of course, accessing our Turath, right? If you knew Farsi, or if you knew Urdu, or you knew Turkish, or any of the other, languages that the Ummah has developed over the centuries, right? And then I'll talk about the last point here, which is Ummatic experiences. And again, this is where I want people to think, my kid, I want them to have a natural affinity for the Ummah. And that only happens if they spend time with the Ummah. And so doing our best to take our hard-earned wealth, and whenever we get an opportunity, rather than spending that time, right, in a local place that's Western, a resort, another Western country, a European experience, that we take them to Muslim countries that will give them that sense of I love the Ummah, I want to be a part of this. We had something great, we still have something great, I want to build it. And I'll just speak from personal experiences, right? Both from going to Egypt the first time and going to Turkey for the first time. I think almost everyone I speak to will say, especially with Turkey, it is a rare example of a Muslim who can go into a Muslim country today and not just see history, but actually even today, it looks beautiful, right? In Egypt, you have the dilemma of masjids that are very, very old, but they're kind of run down in many cases, right? And they're not actually part of the fabric of society. But in Turkey, you get, and I'm sure there's other places people can speak about, but there's a sense of awe. There's an incredible sense of, you compare, again, the UK masjid or the Switzerland masjid or the American masjid that is a tiny little, place, makeshift place. We're doing our best. And maybe it was a garage and now it looks a little bit better. But you go and you say, this is a civilization, right? I come from a rich civilization. And that it imprints on the heart in ways that people cannot explain. It's just, it's not rational. It's not rational that someone can spend a week or two in the Muslim world and come back with this feeling of I feel a whole different sense of belonging, right? And we can add to that more. And the idea here again is that all the stereotypes that have been put upon us by others and by ourselves, they can often break down with those experiences, right? And our children have to witness that. I'll close with a few examples. I know we're getting to our time here. When we were in Turkey this last summer, we went to a Palestinian restaurant to eat. And first time going there, speaking to the brother, he turns out to be from Gaza. And we finish eating and it's very late at night. It's about 11:30 at night. The restaurant closed at 11. But he let us stay and finish our meal. I step outside. I have 2 kids who are sleeping out of my 4 children. And I step outside to grab a taxi, and he's like, "There's no taxis right now." I'm like, "Don't worry, I'll wait." And he comes out after I'm on the steps for 30 seconds, says, "I'm gonna get my car, I'm gonna drive you home." He has no idea who I am. He's never met me before. He doesn't know where I live, right? And my kids were just like, "Baba, do you know this guy?" I said, "No, but he's a Muslim, right? And I'm a Muslim, right? And we connect at that level. There's a sense of trust between us, right?" And I remember my kids just being totally like blown away by this. That this never would happen, right? In most other contexts that are like this, right? And these examples, by the way, happen organically if we put our kids in Umatic, in situations around the Ummah. They will see some of these things. I can give many more examples of stuff like this. I remember being in Egypt, and just sometimes you see the poorest of people. I remember I had a bawab, right? The person who lives, who takes care of the building, right? Poorest of the poor. He knows that I'm an American. And when he sees me, will go and grab the food that literally hardly feeds his kids and come and offer it to me, right? And those things stick with me forever, that this is not a theoretical ummah that used to care for one another. To this day, there is love between the ummah, right? I feel a sense of deep connection, right? Because of those years in Egypt, right? Or those months in Turkey, that it's going to, now if anything happens in those lands, it affects me very, very personally. Why? Because somebody might have done something nice for me, right? It seems it's not rational, but that's how the world works. That's how the hearts work. So the goal again here is that as a parent, are you doing what it takes to put your kids in those experiences so that these good things can happen? Of course, things that are not ideal can happen too, but they're learning experiences. So I think I'll stop there just because I know we have a lot to get into our conversation. But Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feekum, Sheikh Osman. And I was just sort of enjoying the the flow of your talking, and I didn't want to interject because I wanted to sort of hear the full, the full presentation, the full message. And it's very powerful, and it's a strong reminder, and it took me to various places in my own personal life as well, which is, perhaps an interesting way to think about Ummatics as well, because we've all had specific journeys of our own which have made connections with the Ummah possible for us. And I'm probably going to sort of explore some of these questions with yourself. The last point you mentioned reminded me of a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, Ummati kal-ghayth, la yudra awwaluhu khayrun am akhiruhu. That we might live, we might think, okay, we're 1400 years separated from the Prophet ﷺ, but the Prophet himself is saying that my ummah is like a beneficial rain, that we don't know whether its beginning or its end is going to be better, so to speak, for the ummah's well-being. And we see so much khayr in our own times, notwithstanding the tragedy which we also see on a daily basis in our social media feeds, for example, and of course never on the sort of mainstream media, and that's done in a very calculated way. But that also illustrates the sort of various opportunities we have to create ummatic connection. It may be the case that the imperial powers and their offshoots, including these social media brands, are trying what they can to suppress. Imagine if that suppression didn't exist, there would be no chance. And I think whenever I see these stories of suppression and these stories of genocide, and which we do on a daily basis, this is a reminder to me of the vibrancy and the power of the Ummah that induces so much fear that they're willing to engage in a live stream genocide in front of the entire world in a way that their own populations are now horrified by and disgusted by and revolted by. And yet they still persist because this is, in some respects, for them, the last stand. And so I think that gives us a great deal of, it should give us a great deal of hope. And of course, also the fact that all of the Ummah's states are a state of khair. Whether we are suffering, it's good for us. Whether we're in a good place, it can be good for us. And sometimes, the fitna can be in the wealth and the and the abundance. And so, inshallah, I think all of those messages are extremely powerful.
But can we stop on your hadith for a minute? That hadith you mentioned, I actually did want to bring that up. This is such a powerful hadith because I also think that it touches on an issue that there's this belief that we instill in our mashayikh, of course, and everyone else teaches this to us, is that the best of the ummah, right, is the first generation, right, and those who come after them and those who come after them, right. So this is absolutely true. right? That the best of the ummah, right? In terms of like, their taqwa and connection to Allah Azza wa Jalla, of course, the Prophet and his companions. But that shouldn't make us feel that we're useless, right? That, like you said, there's this reign, right? That like our youth need to understand that you actually can have a tremendous impact on the ummah. And the Prophet is telling you that. He's saying that, the downpour could be later down the road, right? And so bringing these hadith up, I think, give us more hope and optimism other than wishing for the glory days, which I think often happens. Oh, the Islamic history was. No, is and will be, needs to be part of that vernacular as well, right? So.
Absolutely. And I think this is where, again, so much of the work that people like yourselves do at Yaqeen is extremely important. This reminder that actually, in so many respects, we're actually succeeding in various ways. It may seem to some that, it's perverse to think about success in the context of genocide. And in some respects, if it's done without that perspective, yes. But at the same time, there's never been so many Muslims alive at any one time in human history. It's just not happened. We are a quarter of the global population. I think there's never been such a large proportion of the global population that's been Muslim at any point in Islamic history. And this is why they need to be sort of suppressed by the major superpowers. They are in genuine fear of the unification of this community, this very powerful, driven community. And if we can get our act together, of course. I wanted to ask you a series of questions, and I'm going to probably sort of go through.
Come back to what you just said. If we get our act together, alhamdulillah, again, being mindful of telling people, like, part of that is not simply the numbers, right? It's, again, telling our children, we are the only ummah that actually holds on to its values in the world. And alhamdulillah, non-Muslims are seeing that everywhere. But that alone, I think, it's framing victory. So when you said, of course, it sounds bad to say that, during a genocide, right, there's victory, but people of Gaza are victorious. Whether they're ashab al-hudud, may Allah protect them, right? But no matter who perishes, if they perish committed to la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, in that, it's like, literally, it's that boy, right? It's the ghulam, right? That when he dies, the whole civilization, right, is willing to accept Allah Azza wa Jal. And that's the qadr of Allah, that, again, we getting out of the materialistic vision of what is success. Right. And our kids have to see that. The kids have to internalize that, like, we can win even though we're actually, in a worldly sense, not on top of certain things, right?
And we see this actually. This is what's really extraordinary in the live stream genocide right now, because, it reminds me when I see these people of the stories of the seerah, where someone says, "Fustu Rabbil Kaaba," he's being killed, right? I've succeeded by the Lord of the Kaaba, and he's being killed literally, and that elicits the conversion of an individual. But when you see these children crying about their parents, I was just watching one of these today, and it's heart-wrenching to watch a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old talk like this. But they're saying, my father's died or my mother's died, and now they're in Jannah, they're fine, but we're still suffering. But that yaqeen that they have, that they're in Jannah, and there's no question. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, of course, la nata'alla ala Allah. But, these people, inshallah, are all shuhada. They're all Ahl Jannah without any hisab, straight, to the heavens. And so, and that yaqeen that you see in a child of 9 and a child of 10 is just extraordinary. And it's humbling. And people convert to Islam. there are so many people who are affected by our dearly departed Ustad Khalid Nabahan, who spoke of the soul of his soul. And then he died a few months later. And that sort of resilience brought so many to tears, including so many non-Muslims, and it continues to. And so, this is, I think, a power that the Ummah has, which also instills so much fear in these kind of people with all of these guns and weaponry and spending in the trillions. And they can't stop these people. It's like forgive the analogy, but in V for Vendetta, at the end, this is one of the Wachowski brothers films, the sort of the person who's the head of this security apparatus is trying to kill this rebel and saying, "Why won't you die?" And it's just this kind of frustration, and this is how they feel towards Muslims. Of course, again, we don't wish for anyone to suffer in the way that our brothers in Gaza are suffering. And we should all, and this is a reminder to us all, we need to do what we can to raise awareness about this. Part of it is raising, children, and it's also where we can support financially. We should support financially where we can raise our voice. But I guess I want to maybe use this to ask a specific question about, how we. There was one particular point you mentioned which made me think of early on in the presentation, and feel free to sort of like switch over to another theme that you covered. But you said at a certain point, there are certain undercover Muslims, extremely wealthy Muslims, but given the environment, they feel sort of like timid and they don't want to advertise their religious identity. And this is how Islamophobia works. This is how the global war on terror and its suppression systems against the Muslims works. This is how the Gaza genocide works. Because if these people had a voice in society, the Gaza genocide would not be possible. If these people were confident and they came out and said, if you do this, we're going to behave in the same way that, a tiny number of very dedicated Zionists are perpetrating this genocide. Their number is vanishingly small on the global scale. Even within the scale of the US sort of imperium, they are a very vanishingly small number of individuals who've managed to indoctrinate a large sort of imperial apparatus. And just imagine those few hundred millionaires, 1 or 2 billionaires perhaps within the Muslim community, if they had invested enough to be able to be openly Muslim, then all of these Muslim countries, we're sitting in some of them, and all of these wealthy Muslim countries that reside in the Gulf, they collectively have, according to a recent Bloomberg analysis, the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar together, as a single unit, they have the largest amount of sovereign wealth of any state, probably the next 3 or 4 states combined globally. They could call the shots on the international stage in this sort of a question without very much difficulty at all. But unfortunately, the verses in the Quran which talk about the unbelievers, تَحْسَبُهُمْ جَمِيعًا وَقُلُوبُهُمْ شَتَّى, unfortunately, sometimes they apply to us. And it's a matter of great shame. Now, in that sort of context, how do we, I think what we're talking about now is generational, an intergenerational shift that we want to think about engineering. How do we create the Ummatic generation which won't feel that sense of shame, which won't feel that sense of timidity, which will recognize the incredible power that exists, that allows us to prevent something like this from happening when we're already like a quarter of the global population, and yet our brothers and sisters can be killed with impunity for years almost.
Yeah, so I think that question comes back to the same principles we spoke about. You're right. I remember growing up, it was the same idea. It's like, you don't wear your faith on your sleeve, right? You do your best to practice in a way that's discreet. Part of that sometimes is couched under language of, well, we have to be tolerant of the society. We don't want to, make people uncomfortable. But again, for me, a couple things. So one is parents. Are the parents modeling that? If you see your dad, no matter what time it is, he doesn't care where he is, he will pray on the sidewalk in the Western country. That is huge. You see him willing to make wudu in the sink, right? Or you see him making dawah, like subhanAllah, just children look at these things and say, if my dad is not scared to show his Islam, or my mom is not scared to show her Islam, why should I be scared to show my Islam, right? So that modeling is very important. And if they see, my dad's name is Muhammad, but he tells all his non-Muslim friends he's Mo, right? It's a very, very clear. The dad never said it. The dad never told the kid, hide your faith. But this signal is picked up in these little ways. So parents have to be extra conscious of this in doing it. Number 2 is the issue of jama'ah, right? Because this is the Hadith of Prophet ﷺ, right? We can't be a lone wolf. To expect people to have the resilience to be like Ibrahim alayhi salam, that I don't care if the whole world is disbelieving, and I'm just going to wear my faith on my sleeve, and I'm going to call you to Islam, and I'm going to call out your batil, your falsehood. It's not going to happen with most people. So this is why we have to put our children into spaces where they can do things as a group, right? Just a little simple example, right? I remember that even if Muslim kids are going, for instance, to watch a movie together, right? If there's a second Muslim kid in a group of friends, it's much easier to say, I need to step up, but let's pray together, right? Because you're not alone in this behavior, versus you having to be the lone individual who does this behavior that looks very strange inside of your group. So for parents, making sure your kids are always in a group of Muslims so they can feel that sense of group solidarity and group belonging. And but they encourage one another in these things. For especially a young Muslim girl, one of the most, I haven't done the study on this yet, I hope to, but I know there's enough data that shows some of these findings, that like if someone that looks like her in her school, right, that wears a hijab in her school, right, the odds of her wearing hijab are probably going to go up, right? Because now it becomes an issue of I can do this as a collective. And I know this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but I'll double down on it for our Western audience. London, you guys are lucky. In Britain, Muslims are a little bit more densely populated, right? So you don't have the same problem that Muslims who are maybe off in other European countries or even America. Sometimes in America, you're the only Muslim kid in your whole school or in your entire community, right? It's really important. I don't want to, maybe we can shift later talking about hijrah and the idea of hijrah, but sometimes we think about these in these polar extremes. I want my kid to be Ummatic. I have to make him live, in the Muslim world, and that's the only option. But actually moving your kid from the middle of nowhere where he's the only Muslim in his neighborhood to another neighborhood in your same city, county, state, country, whatever it might be, that's still maybe, not a Muslim country, but has enough Muslim density, can activate that identity as well, right? So this idea of like, it doesn't have to be, if you can't do the ideal and move to the other side of the world, even if you wanted to, just moving locally, which by the way, we have limited resources, right? That's also a problem. If you think about people of dawah, there's very few English du'at relative to their populations. You know that in the UK as well, that for every one person who's learned, there's thousands and thousands of lay Muslims, right? So when you move to a more densely populated area, you're able to utilize those resources in a much more efficient way, essentially, right?
I mean, that's a really intriguing point as well about the way in which if you're isolated in that way. I actually personally felt this when I moved from the UK to the United States, because I grew up in London and Manchester, which are two major cities, the largest population centers in the UK. And there are going to be hundreds of thousands, if not, in a place like London, over 1 million Muslims. And you just feel, you were saying that, when you're trying to, I think, young girls, sisters find this a greater challenge than men, because, you can pass for non-Muslim, as it were, but you put a headscarf on and it's like you're immediately marked.
Mm-hmm.
And not just immediately marked, but you're marked in a way that is extremely demeaning in Western society, in mainstream Western society. And so, but at the same time, you go to places like East London, and most sisters that I know wear the headscarf. I mean, I would suspect, and there isn't a sister on this panel right now, so we can't really do an assessment, that there's a certain peer pressure in some of these communities for girls to wear the hijab once they come to a kind of adulthood. Just to be part, and that's a positive peer pressure that you can have only where Muslims are relatively densely populated. And when I was living in those environments, I'd go out in a thobe, I'd be very comfortable. I lived in central Jersey for 5.5 years. I don't think I wore a thobe on campus once, maybe once in 5.5 years. It felt extremely unnatural. And so, I mean, it's a real challenge. And so making an effort to create a situation where you aren't sort of the isolated sheep that is potential target of the wolf, as the Hadith puts it, is incredibly important, as you put it. And it also, for children who are developing their sense of identity, and framed it very beautifully with multiple layers, which I'd like to come back to, inshallah. When a children is in such a vulnerable position and they see a timidity from their own parents about these sorts of things, that makes it all the more difficult. And so, this is something which, I guess the question would be from my end, like, how do you ensure that if it does require a bit of an upheaval? Like, I'll give one final anecdote. My uncle, he moved from, he has 4 children, and he used to live in New York, then he moved to rural Pennsylvania. And then he, every time he moved, he was concerned about, okay, where can my children have a good, robust Muslim community for them to be able to mix with other Muslims and preserve their religious identity? I don't know how common that is. And what does one do to encourage greater numbers of Muslims in these sorts of parts of the world where they are few and far between, or they are likely to be kind of assimilated in mainstream culture? How do you motivate parents to think about this? And if there's a Muslim child who has nonchalant parents who aren't terribly interested in their religious identity, but they want to cultivate that, what do they do in those circumstances? Because I assume that there must be vast numbers of people in those categories.
Oh, who are living in the less densely populated ones, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, these are all the real challenges that people face, right? And issues of employment are often what drive these things, right? So they're not. Sometimes there's no choice, right? If you're, if you end up in a place with only a handful of Muslims, but again, it comes back to this idea of it's people sometimes they feel they have no agency, right? They feel like someone else has to build it, someone else has to do it, right? Subhanallah, one good thing about I think the Western Muslims, especially our parents' generation and before, was that they kind of didn't have this mindset. They were okay saying we're three Muslims in a town, we're going to do Jummah in my garage, right? And it starts from there, right? And I really think that everyone needs to own that as an individual to say it doesn't. I don't need to have a giant center yet. If I'm here and I need to be here, what can I do to make this a Muslim community? Now, by the way, that actually helps in being Umatic. Why? Because first, you hardly have any Muslims, which means that you don't have the picking to be like, well, only Pakistani Muslims to build a Pakistani masjid, right? Which often happens in the West, right? Or enough Arabs if I'm, of an Arab. You got to deal with every single person. Okay, you know what? There's a Sudani brother here. There's a Pakistani brother here. There's an Egyptian brother here. There's a Malaysian, family there. Let's make a masjid together, right? And I think that, by the way, is a point for Western Muslims that is a source of pride. Right? And we tell that to our kids because, again, I don't know how the UK works, but and Europe as much. In America, churches are by ethnicity. Very, very common to have the Korean church, the Chinese church, right? The Baptist church, which are mainly African American, and so it's very racially segregated, right? And further to be like, oh, you know what? You can have like when you tell this to non-Muslims, like, oh, your mosque is just Muslims from all over the world. That's kind of strange to them a little bit, right? But again, I want to come back to issues like you can't. So there's a sense of amana that you have to be honest with yourself and Allah. And we have a forthcoming paper on hijrah coming out soon that delves into this. You have to ask yourself some very hard questions as a parent. I've come here to the West, or I'm born here, and I'm living in a place without a good Muslim community. Where is my kid at right now? Or if I don't have kids, you have to think about what is the potential for this community to provide him with what's necessary to grow up as a good Muslim. Is there a masjid? Is there a social circle? Is there an Islamic school? Whatever ingredients that one thinks is necessary. And there's two ways to go about this. If the answer is no, it doesn't exist, either you have to create it or you go move somewhere where it exists, right? There's no third option. And both of those, there's agency, right? And saying, I can select and create an environment that is suitable for my kids, right? And that's what Allah is going to ask you at the end of the day. Did you do something about it, right? And we have the ayah something sorry when people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks them, but what's going on? And they say, كُنَّا مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ فِي الْأَرْضِ, right? أَوَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةٌ فَتُهَاجِرُوا فِيهَا. Like, you can't use that as an excuse that we were oppressed in the land, the Islamophobia was intense. Allah's going to say, wasn't the world vast? You could go anywhere you want. It didn't have to be another country. It could be another town, like I said. Or you bring strength into your town, right? By you building a masjid or you building a community center. So I think people have to be more agentic and realize that it's them and they have to band together. And that's the concept of Ummah. We band together for the greater good, essentially, right?
There's a beautiful verse, of course, which is a dua, which, I mean, to a certain extent, I can't think of the wider context of the verse off the top of my head, but it's a reminder of the responsibility which comes with becoming a parent. When Allah says, رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَجَعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. Like you're talking about marriage, you're talking about children, and immediately you're thinking about, okay, there has to be imamah here, there has to be leadership, there has to be a kind of a motivation that drives other people and leads other people, as it were. So I think, people very often kind of fall into marriage and children because these are just rites of passage. But we live in a context very often. I mean, we're in a bit of an exceptional situation, you and I, at this point in time. But and this, inshallah, is a kind of an important sort of a step in our lives to try and create that ummatic reality for our own children as well. But those of us who live in the West, and a lot of the Ummatic's audience is in the West, and a lot of the Ummatic's audience, inshallah, we hope that we'll eventually get to a place where it reflects the proportions of the Ummah in different parts of the world. And so the majority would be in the Muslim world. But a lot of us face this reality of, how do we preserve our children's religious identity in a world that is actually relatively hostile to it? And, we had a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, Ustad Yahya Burt, giving a presentation of Umma at the margins, talking about something like 22% of the Muslim Ummah lives outside of the Muslim majority world. And so this isn't a small section of the community, it's a very sizable chunk, a fifth of the Ummah, a fifth to a quarter of the Ummah that is in this situation. So I really appreciate sort of your reflections in this regard. I wanted to highlight, someone did ask a question, which is, we've touched on, but not explicitly, so I want you to maybe elaborate on that. They are saying, is it possible to nurture an Ummatic identity in our children in their later years, their late teens and early 20s, if it wasn't nurtured in their early years? If so, how can we do that? Very important question.
Yeah, exactly. It is a beautiful question, and the answer is absolutely yes. Again, what I was speaking about, the teenage years, these are, again, there's no hard rule. This is not like, it starts at this age and ends at this age. This identity formation process is ongoing. It starts around early adolescence, I'd say around 10, 11, 12, but it continues into the late teens, into the early 20s, and actually throughout the lifespan, right? There's no point where it's too late. It's a really, really important point. But what can you do later in life? So actually later in life, the kid gets more agency, which is interesting. So you have to recognize that now you don't, like, I could take my 8-year-old and say, we're flying to Istanbul for the summer. Might be harder with my 20-year-old, right? But what can you do is you want to encourage your kid. I go back to motivation, telling them to do things that offer them Omatic experiences. So as an example, do you want to tell your kids who are in college? Honestly, I did this myself. It was one of the best things that I was able to do, was to study abroad. Right, I was in college, and I said, you know what? I had a bunch of friends, in the MSA who spoke Arabic. I was very keen on learning Arabic. I said, let me go to Egypt because there's an American university there I can study at. Right, it was something which I chose to do, but it allowed me to connect with the Ummah kind of on my own terms. But my parents supported me in that. Right, so are we encouraging our children, even as they're getting older in life, to go and spend time in the Muslim world, making that a possibility? Maybe taking things like a gap year if they need to, maybe financially supporting them to do those type of things. And then we can go on to other things. What about marriage? That's probably one of the biggest points of contention when it comes to being Ummatic, right? So many parents, now their kids are in their early 20s, it's time to get married. And now the kid is like, okay, I'm looking to get married, and the parents will define a criteria. If you say you can only marry within our ethnic group, you're really not thinking very Ummatically in this point, right? And of course, there's issues of why that might be beneficial, and there's language reasons, and I'm not going to ignore all that. But this idea that this is the only group worthy of being married into, right, because of some national or ethnic superiority, that is, of course, killing any Ummatic sentiment in the child. So to tell a child, look, what we want is a good religious person from a good family, right? Of course, there's ways that we can connect, and language might affect some of these things, but the sky's the limit, right? I'll give you an example. Imagine you have a family that's Arabic speaking, and they're like, well, we really want someone who speaks Arabic. Will they allow them to marry someone who picked up Arabic as a second language or a third language? Or is it about ethnically Arab, right? These are the types of little things that, again, kids can pick up on and say, my parents love the Ummah, they care about the Ummah, they cherish the Ummah, right? And honestly, in some regards, especially for those of us who live in Western settings where are much more mixed, I think it's important to encourage marriage outside of our ethnic group, right? I really think it's important, because that only strengthens those bonds that we need to have. Right, because we can't be in our ethnic communities, like it makes us more fragmented. So I would encourage, keeping what I mentioned in mind, things to do with language issues or other factors. Try and tell your kids, I'm happy if you married someone. It's not like I tolerate it. It makes me happy and it brings me joy, right? Because it's part of our deen, it's part of our tradition, right? Right? And of course, I know that's the second part. We talked about education, we talked about marriage, but even again, your kids still pick up on what you do even as you get older. And so if your kids are seeing you model that even into their late teens, even into their early 20s, they're still going to pick up on this. Mom and dad, they go and spend time with the Ummah. They behave in a way that reflects that they care about them. Don't ever think that it's too late. This is not it's, like I said, it's not a switch that turns off. You will always have an influence on your child. Oftentimes, interesting, what happens is kids, especially after they get married, even, that's kind of when they want to come back to their home values, right? Because at adolescence time is the age of exploration. Hey, I know what it's like to be a Muslim from this background, but what is it like to be the other people, right? So you might see kids in those teenage years, in the early college years, especially experimenting and doing things that we don't like. I think it's important. Sometimes we tolerate it as long as it's not too far out into the margins. And then when they're a little bit older, they're going to be the ones who want to come back to that. Because they're going to see, for the most part, the un-Islamic, the lifestyle of kufr, as much as the marketing agency wants to tell you that it's beautiful, it's actually disgusting and it's vile, right? And most people see that, right? I mean, anyone who's gone to a Western university sees this, what happens in those Western universities with the students. And that's ainul yaqeen. It's like, I wanted to have the agency to explore it. I explored it. I don't want it anymore. Now, mom and dad are there, and they're kind of, again, that they're the ones who grounded me. So I also want to tell parents, even if your kids venture out of this for a period of time, don't lose hope. You just got to stick to the plan. And often there's what we call a boomerang effect, that they come back to that value system when they see essentially that, hey, what was on the other side of the fence actually wasn't greener, right? So.
Barakallah fikum. I mean, this reminds me of something my own teacher, Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi, used to say, that, this is a time, that age, the adolescent years, when people sometimes go off the rails. And it's important to always leave the door open for your children. They say, okay, I'm not praying anymore. You do what you can to encourage, but you never shut them out. They say, I'm no longer Muslim anymore, he even said, as far as I recall in one instance. And he would say, you never shut them out, because they're going to come back home. They're always going to come back home. And so, this reminds me of one of the definitions of the Sahaba. This is, I think, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. He says, الصحابي من رأى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ومات مسلما ولو تخلل ذلك ردة, which is a fascinating definition.
Yeah.
A Sahabi is someone who saw the Prophet and died a Muslim, even if there was an intervening period of apostasy, because some of the Sahaba unfortunately did participate in the Ridda wars. They apostated, but then they came back and they actually did good for the Ummah. So if that can happen to people who saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I think we owe our children to be a bit more patient with them. Allahu a'lam. Barakallahu fikum, Ustad. So I wanted to actually also highlight a question.
Can we come back to that a bit?
Yes, please,
I think it's worth spending some time on this issue of parental autonomy. Again, this is part of a different conversation about religious parenting, but it applies to Umatic as well. This is the tension of being a parent. If you had to distill the tension of being a parent, it is between wanting to hold on to them because you believe you know what's good for them, and you need to let them go so they can kind of independently explore the world. And we're always between these two. How much can I let go and how much do I have to pull them in, right? And I will emphasize here that oftentimes with adolescents, what the kids want is not that so they want to do things autonomously, even if that thing is something which, how should I word this? Like, they know you want it, but they won't do it unless it's autonomously done by them. I'll give you an example, right? You'll have a kid who will say, for instance, if mom or dad is the one who's on their back about a certain behavior, the kid is feeling coerced. I have to do this on my own accord. I should give a very vivid example. There are students sometimes who are doing memorization of the Quran. And in their path of memorization, they may be burning out, exhaustion, fatigue, whatever it might be. And parents sometimes come back. I've had these talks with some parents. They say, my kid has got 25 juz. He wants to quit right now, right? I said, how old is he? He's like 16 years old, right? I said, he's like, he's starting to have a very adverse relationship with the Quran because he just feels like he can't balance everything in life. He's feeling a lot of pressure. He's like, the parent is really, really saying you're almost there and really forcing them to do it. And I told the parents something. I said, listen, is being a hafiz, is this fard? No, it's not, right? I said, but is having a love for the Quran an obligation? Of course. I says, do not jeopardize your desire, your personal nafsi desire that my kid becomes a hafiz for their love of the Quran. They want to have agency. Let your kid decide what he wants to do. If he leaves and he never comes back to that, and he knows 25 juz of Quran, khair wa barakah, that's actually quite impressive. But I said, what's most likely going to happen is once he or she takes a break, gathers their bearings, now they're going to say, I have the choice to memorize or not. And they're going to say, oh, actually, I want to finish the Quran. Right? And I remember a few parents actually had this exact scenario, and they called me back a few months later. So, Sheikh, Jazakallah khair, my son or daughter needed a few months break. He's like, Mom, I want to finish the Quran now. So it's this issue of human nature is they want to be in control. I'll give you another example. I've said this many times before, but it's kind of a funny one to me. Think about if your child, or we can even use adults, but let's use adults for now. If Osama, your wife, is at home, and she's about to wash the dishes because she sees all the dishes on the sink, right? And then you look across the house and you see the sink full of dishes and you yell, wash the dishes, it's piling up. She was about to wash the dishes. Now, all of a sudden, it went from an autonomous behavior to a coerced, controlled behavior. The human instinct is what? I don't want to wash the dishes. You wash them, right? So I want parents to get that example and to be like, look, you think you're doing good, but you're actually thinking short term, right? Let it go sometimes. Allow them that space and allow them to autonomously select into it. And inshallah, like Sheikh Akram mentioned, they will come back if you've set an environment of love, care, and genuine, like, of warmth, where they know this is a good space, right? The kids who don't want to come back are the kids who've gone through traumatic experiences, right? That's what it comes down to. A kid who's like, look, I was yelled at, I was beaten, I was harassed, I was coerced to do good. I never want to do that good, right? So just parents be very, you got to think this is a marathon. This is not a sprint, right?
And that's actually, I mean, that final point is a bit concerning, which is that people can actually do damage because they have a passion for something which is good, but it's an imbalanced passion. It's not a passion that is put in a perspective which is what would be pleasing to Allah. Because ultimately we have to think about the maqsid. Maqsid is to get them to love the Quran. And if what you're doing is so coercive that it, and that human nature that you spoke of, the natural tendency to want to own something and not be forced to do it as though I'm the slave of someone else, and that's what only reason I'm doing it, I think is that's a very bad place to leave one's child. And Allahu A'lam, but part of that responsibility falls on the parent if they're treating them that way, that their son or daughter is become distanced from the Quran. And we pray that ultimately their own natural fitrah, I think it was Shakespeare who coined the expression "blood is thicker than water." I'm not sure, but the tendency to come back to home, back to your sort of like parents, I think is a very strong impulse. And so, inshallah, there's always hope. There's always hope. I wanted to take a moment to just mention a brother. He said, Jazakumullah khairan, watching right now from Nigeria, and brother Ismail Hashim. So Jazakumullah khairan for messaging us from Nigeria. It's good for us to be reaching the wider Ummah, and Nigeria is one of the up-and-coming states in the Ummah with, the potentially, I think, the largest population in the Ummah within a few years' time, potentially even beating Indonesia. But he has a comment or a question, I think. So he says, thank you so much. I would like the speaker to provide us with hints of how to eschew sectarian tensions from the mindsets of our children while postulating a more universal vision of Islamic Muslim solidarity. I think the sectarian dimension is something worth reflecting on as well. So if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll take one dimension of it, which I think is the most common one, which is I'll just talk about even like intra-Sunni sectarianism, right? And I think this is something that overlaps with a lot of things we've spoken about because it intersects with ethnicity at times. And so for the Muslim parent to, number one, recognize within the umbrella of our orthodoxy of Sunni Islam, that is where we want to have a lot of tolerance and flexibility and systematically expose our kids to it, right? And I want to really emphasize that. When you raise a kid who believes that the only way to do things are according to your madhab, which maybe is overlapped with the country of origin, right? So again, if you're from Morocco, there's only the Maliki way of doing it, or you're from Pakistan, it's only the Hanafi way of doing it, right? Or you're from Saudi, or you're from Qatar, it's only the Hanbali way of doing it. That creates a very rigid child who, when he sees other people doing things, he's confused by it. He's like, that doesn't seem like it's real Islam, right? And so these kind of ultra ethnic masjids can often really undermine that Umatic solidarity because it others the other one and says, we do things this way, right? And what they do is not real Islam. I'll give a funny example. Samas is real. I was reading from Tirmidhi in the masjid when I was the imam and giving sharh of some of the hadith, and some of the hadith did not connect with. They were, and I'm just giving an explanation. They were not in line with the Hanafi fiqh positions. And so we have some of the uncles in the masjid are very upset, and they go outside and they say, this is Egyptian Islam that the sheikh is telling us, because I have an Azhari background. Yes. But the point here is that because it was not in line with Hanafi fiqh, for them, it was like, this is a problem. We can't be promoting this, right? So I actually encourage the opposite. We should take our kids, and actually you made this point with the brother from Nigeria and Africa, and there's so many different authentic traditional ways of practicing that we need to inculcate our kids into, right? Like, I want them to see, Like, alhamdulillah, we went to Morocco, right? And alhamdulillah, we're blessed to visit Morocco last year. Like, the kids really saw it's very different, right? Right, the way they pray is different, right? The way that just the whole society operates, and for them to be like, they're just as Muslim as we are, right? They're not any less Muslim, right? And then you take them to Turkey, and the Turkish practice also is very different, right? Both, sometimes, and again, not just fiqh only, but even when it comes to certain even schools of aqidah, right? So whether one is Athari, right, or Maturidi, right, or Ash'ari, or any of these things, to let people know, look, this is all within the scope of the Ummah. And I know, especially today, it's important because these things become really like tension point. The best way to overcome this is teaching your kids Islamic history. It's the easiest way, right? Because we want the next Salahuddin. But what madhab did he come from, right? These are uncomfortable things people don't want to get into because they feel so stuck to it, right? So as a parent and as an Islamic educator, when you do this, you break down those boundaries. It doesn't matter to me. Like, I'm an Athari. Whether the head of the army is an Ash'ari or he's a Hanbali is irrelevant to me, right? And so I would say that it's intra-Sunni is very easy to do. Right? I don't think that should take a lot of effort. We set those boundaries of Ahl Sunnah and make it very clear that none of this is superior than another. And I want to maybe emphasize that a lot. It's not simply you tolerate it. It's not simply that it's okay if someone does things differently than I do and their philosophy is different. It's, in many cases, it's as good, right? And there's a difference between tolerating it, right? I can tolerate the Shafi'is, but my madhab is better. That's not what I'm speaking about, right? I'm speaking, no, this is a rich tradition that actually is an asset to the Ummah. It is equal to anything that where I come from, what I believe. And I want my kids to know that. And they have the choice and the flexibility and the freedom to spend time with people from those backgrounds, right? Studying with them, whether it be fiqh, right, or aqidah or suluk or anything else. That is the easiest way for me to talk about intra-Sunni. I think outside of Sunni, it gets a little bit harder. So I will leave that maybe for another conversation. Right? So.
Perhaps, and I mean, mashallah, there have been important conversations within the Ummatics community, including in I think the director of research, Ustad Umar Anjum, is one of the scholars who really reflects on these sorts of questions in a way that is, in many respects, pioneering, because those sorts of questions, I think, are more important at the political realm. But occasionally they might even come into sort of at the personal realm. And it's important for us to have answers to those. So we're not dismissing it as an important area, but it's just this, I think, does require its own sort of dedicated discussion to think about.
And I think your point of it being personal versus political is very, very important, right? It's you can set boundaries about individual relations that are very, very important, right? So for instance, I have no problem with the parent saying, when it comes to issues of marriage or fiqh or aqidah, we only follow from the Sunni tradition, right? And we're not going to say, go ahead and borrow from those other traditions that are outside of ours. But when it comes to international relations, that might be very, very different, right? It might be where there's a case of having to ally with nations that don't fall within it because there's a greater maslahah for the ummah, right? And that requires a certain level of maturity and thought. Actually, I remember it's just recently, I was, alhamdulillah, enjoying some of the reflections of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah on politics. And this idea came up of like, do you want to have, he says, it's very hard to find people in the ummah who have both the two traits that are needed for leadership, right? He says it's quwwa and amana, right? You need strength, physical and intellectual strength, and you need to be trustworthy. Right? He goes, very hard to find that. So the classical issue is that if you had a choice, you only have an option of the righteous who's weak, right? Or the rebellious who's strong. Who do you want to be in power? Right. And he actually has a long discussion on it. And he actually says in many cases, you want the one who's actually fajr, but who's strong, right? And he explains why. He goes, why? Because his quwwa, his strength, is in the service of Islam and Muslims, while his fujur, sometimes, especially if it's not too public, right? It's personal for him between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So the political is very different, right, than the personal. And we just have to be, I think, literate enough to know when to invoke which principles get invoked on the personal level or on the governmental level.
And this, may make some people sort of a little uncomfortable, but this is something which is the realm of the ulama. They will basically provide guidance on exactly when this applies. But there are explicit hadiths on this, Inna Allah la yansuru hada din bir rajul al-fajir.
Exactly.
And this man who the hadith was about was, the hadith was a comment on a man who participated in jihad, and he did a great deal of damage to the enemy. But then at a crucial point when he was injured, he commit suicide to
Yes.
put himself out of his misery. And so this was actually one of the Sahaba was told by the Prophet that this person is not going to behave in an exemplary way. And he came to, and the Prophet made this comment, and the Sahabi witnessed what happened, and he came to the Prophet and said, "Ashhadu annaka Rasulullah." It was a
Yes.
prophecy from the Prophet. And so, this is the Prophet ﷺ didn't say to this person, "You're not allowed to fight in my army because you're going to end things in an inappropriate way, and you're not going to do something that is pleasing to Allah." No, he actually still drew on his it's a very serious talent and ability in the battlefield. So,
but I think the key
these
issue again, like you mentioned, the key issue that's very tricky and that we have to is that even if they're fajr, or even if they're not, righteous in a certain way, that their loyalties are still to Islam and the Muslims. I think that's where any of the sectarian issues need to be very important. Is your loyalty to the Ummah, right, or is it to your sect, right? And if your loyalty is to your sect and you're willing to undermine the greater Ummah, then there's no, that's not the place of where we have solidarity, right? But if they're maybe deviant, ideologically, right, but their loyalties are toward the Ummah. I mean, I can give an obvious example. I think today is many Muslims around the world are very happy with the behavior of some of the Muslims in Yemen, right, who are supporting our Palestinian brothers and sisters, right? Yeah. Ideologically, there's some misalignment on some of this stuff, right?
Sure.
Right. But it's not that because there's an ideological misalignment that we have no concern or we're not allied with them in this regard, right? So yes. These are.
And also I think the ulama might occasionally have some disagreements on this, but these are this is the fiqh of the ummah at that level. I think the average Muslim who's concerned about raising their children doesn't need to be especially concerned about, number one. Number two, there should be some Muslims who are specifically dedicated to this sort of stuff, and they are the specialists to consult on these issues as well, inshallah. But Jazakumullah khair, very, very valuable. And I am a bit conscious of time. I hope I wanted to ask a few more questions, if that's okay with yourself.
Yeah, of course.
Barakallah fikum. And I liked that slide that you had earlier. I actually took a screenshot of it for myself, which had 7 types of identity. Okay. So just to read out, you spoke of racial identity, national identity, Ummatic identity, gender identity, capitalist identity, social class, and political identity. And I wanted to sort of query 2 things, I suppose. One is the category of identity itself, which has become quite politicized, and we think about identity politics as well, which means something very specific. But the other is that it's interesting that you put Ummatic identity there. And I mean, this might be a bit of an academic question, so you can redirect it if you find it's maybe less beneficial. But we can also think about maybe religious identity and public political identity, because political identity I don't see as especially distinct from religious identity in an Ummatic frame. Okay. Because one's political identity can overlap significantly with one's Ummatic identity. But there's also religious identity in the private frame, which is about one's devotion, one's salah, etc. And, as we just discussed, someone might have serious deficiencies at the private, personal, religious level, and they have good intentions for the ummah, and potentially they can be utilized in that way. And I think maybe there are ways in which we can think about these framings that, acknowledge that there are important ways in which the religious can have private and political and public dimensions. So the Ummatic, I think, divides into those 2. That's kind of one point. And the other point, as I mentioned, was identity politics has become it's a hot potato, sort of hot topic in the current situation. It's extremely polarized discourses. Social media has become a complete minefield, and the red pill movement and all of these sorts of things. And, anti-wokeism and wokeism. A lot of that is highly gendered as well. And so there's kind of like a major issue, which I haven't read the literature on, but there's a lot of literature now about the way in which men and women have become extremely divided in Western societies. I don't know about Muslim societies, if those sorts of, and partly this seems to be a consequence of certain types of social media, kind of experiment that we've conducted on human beings en masse, and especially dangerous on children. With respect to social media. And so, countries like Australia are considering a social media ban up to the age of 16. I don't know if it's passed legislative processes yet, but I wanted to ask about basically identity, and I guess a third appendage would be social media, the dangers of social media. How do we think about raising Ummatic children in the world of social media?
Allah barik fiik. Okay, we'll do one at a time. So you're right. The Ummatic Islamic identity is separate than the personal religious identity. And again, these were just meant to be examples, right? These seven. They could become infinite as society begins to classify these things in different ways. And for me, it was less about what is real and what is not. It's from a psychological perspective, the perception is reality, right? So even if there's no such thing really as this type of an identity, if the discourse that the kid is exposed to is triggering this, I'll give you an example. Growing up, for most of us in the West, this polarization of gender stuff did not exist, right? It's a much more modern phenomena. So most men are not thinking, first of all, the question doesn't come up. For the most teenagers are not saying, what is my gender identity? Am I really male or am I female or am I some other, am I fluid, right? Am I a third gender? Like that phenomena did not exist. It doesn't enter the consciousness, right? So it wasn't even like, if I was to make this slide for most, for youth 20 years ago, I wouldn't even have that on there perhaps, right? Or it would have maybe manifested only very, very particular things, right? And so you're right, these are social constructions. They're social constructions that are often crafted by nefarious actors in the world. My point is that our youth are being exposed to it. So whether we like them or not is irrelevant. They exist in the world. They are being promoted, and our kids are being asked in school settings, in social settings, in places, where are you on this, right? What do you think about this? What side of the spectrum are you on? So that's where I mean our kids are grappling with this and have to come to some conclusion as to where they are. Coming back to your point, that's why parents, I want them to really be clear that Omatic Islamic identity is a separate thing you have to work on, right? It is its unique way of understanding the world that is different than, again, the secular version of religion. Because the secular version of religion is saying you're allowed to be a Muslim, but it's something personal within the four walls of your home. And most countries are accepting of that, right? Western secular countries are saying, you want to pray in your house, you want to fast in your house, it's fine, right? This is, of course, well known to the Umatic groups, but like, we want to tell them, no. We're trying to think about something bigger than this. We're talking about both Islam at a societal level, and we're talking about you connecting with Muslims and being allied with Muslims right outside of the walls of your house, in your community, in your state, in your country, in the world. And that has deliberate practices you have to do. Putting your kid in a fiqh class is not going to teach them to think ummatically, right? That might require international trips. It might require a different type of a curriculum. It might require different types of projects that show people, or history, education. Each has its own lever to pull, right? And of course, Islam has something to say about all these identities. Islam has something to say about your racial identity, your gender identity, and so on and so forth. But again, my point here is that parents recognize this is not going to organically happen. It has to be something that I deliberately think through and have a game plan for. And inshallah, right, with that, it moves up further. You asked, the third point you mentioned was about social media, right? Yeah, I mean, as someone who has studied this a lot, oftentimes the ideal is very hard to enact, but I am a strong believer that the effect of social media on our youth is far greater than we can measure. It's immeasurable. And the reason why is because it's hard to measure it, because everyone is breathing the same air, essentially, right? It's very hard to distinguish. We don't really have the chance now to understand a kid without social media from the kid with social media, because even that is not random, right? The kid who doesn't have it, it's often forced upon them, which has all kinds of other consequences. But again, the ideal is we have to be extremely careful. Our children want to connect with the world. That's what they want to do. They want to understand the world. How do you as a parent help them navigate that? I definitely think that there's two extremes. One extreme is that I will shelter them and never allow them access to it because the world is corrupt. And the other is, you know what, our kids have to learn, let's throw them into the fire, right? These are two problems. And I always tell people, like, look, anything, and if I literally use that example of fire, it's true, fire has benefit. But I will not allow my 5-year-old son to go and play with, or maybe 5-year-old, I'm a little bit extreme on this, but I wouldn't let my 2-year-old son, I have a 2-year-old, go and play with the fire, and because look, you're going to burn yourself. Yes, you could cook food with it. Yes, you could warm yourself with it. Yes, you could light and have light in the room with it. But the odds are you're going to end up burning yourself, and it's going to be more of a problem than it is a benefit. And I think this analogy, right, وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا, right, as Allah talks about in the Quran with other alcohol and other intoxicants and gambling and so on and so forth, applies in this case. There is good in these things. You can learn from it. But when a kid has to be incredibly well-grounded in their worldview, because what's happening is these tools are shaping how they understand the world. And especially with AI coming out, most of it is fake. And most of it, parents have to understand, is it's designed for engagement. I think adults don't understand this point, let alone children. But most of what me and you engage with on social media is not a reflection of any reality. It's someone saying, if I say this really polarizing thing that's wild and crazy about this ethnic group or this gender or this religion or this political event, it's going to get a lot of conversation. And what does it do? It charges up people, right? And it does all kinds of things to their nafs that is probably unhealthy. So in my opinion, children needs to stay off. They should be off social media for at least until some point in their late teenage years, ideally, right? Until they perhaps have to engage with it. And by the way, sometimes schools are very clever about this, and educational institutions. Like, you cannot live without technology at times. Why? Because the whole classroom communicates through this certain tool, as an example, right? Or the teacher's using this tool as an example, right? So sometimes you're forced to engage with it. That's when you have to say, I must educate my child, and we must, as a community, educate our children on how to use these tools appropriately. Like, having this knowledge is not going to remove the problem, but it helps with it, right? And if I give you a more extreme example, think about young girls. When young girls are on social media, and the data is showing that young girls are more affected negatively than young boys, what are they seeing? They're seeing airbrushed versions of every single person that's out there. Even if they know that those other people are airbrushed, it affects their self-image, right? But as a parent, you have to know that and say, now, what do I do? How do I ensure my daughter, how do I keep her off of it first? And second of all, if I can't keep her off of it, what are the guardrails around this? And how do I educate her about these things? And how do I offer her opportunities to feel beautiful in other spaces so that she does not try to express it in those spaces that are inappropriate? So the reality is, these are incredibly difficult conversations to have. But again, as long as we're beholden to the Western tools, and again, this is maybe where I will say from an Umatic perspective, maybe one of the most pressing issues of the Ummah is the need for autonomy and technology. Right? It is, I cannot stress this enough, right? Once we're stuck to YouTube, social media, Intel, any of these other hardware or software tools, we don't control the discourse. We don't control anything in that universe, and we are beholden to whatever it is that they will tolerate from us. So any Muslims who have the ability, I would say, investment and engineering skills, and that should be dedicated to autonomous technology, that is value driven. Again, it doesn't need to be Muslim centric, but something that reflects our values, so that way a child can engage with it and get some of the benefit without all the detriment. So, Allahu A'lam.
Allahu A'lam. No, this is actually, I mean, we probably need to have a dedicated Ummatics subgroup that is thinking about these questions, because this is an area which I've also spent, I mean, on the AI front, spent a lot of time sort of trying to learn about, because these days as scholars, you can't, there was a report in the last week or two from the CEO of Anthropic saying that there's a kind of coming AI apocalypse. 20% of white collar jobs, particularly at the entry level, won't exist in a couple of years' time. And so, there is a need to be on top of these things. But at the same time, and Google just released VO3, which is a video sort of generation engine, which is, I mean, absolutely insane. Like, there's almost no way of distinguishing between it and reality. And so with those sorts of things, and to think about the vulnerable minds of children being exposed and potentially manipulated by these, supercomputers and with superhuman intelligence is quite frightening. And so I do think, I mean, I don't think this is a Luddite reaction. Children are vulnerable. We protect them. We prohibit them from driving cars. We prohibit them from consuming sort of like, or getting prescriptions without their parental consent and so on. And so it makes sense to me that, there should be, I'm not planning, my children are very young, but when they come of age, I'm not planning to give them access to a smartphone. And any sort of computer or tablet they have is very restricted, and it is incumbent on parents to educate themselves. There are plenty of tutorials online of how to restrict your devices. My children are very young, but they, once they get to the age of 10 or 11, they'll start to figure out, how do I get around these sorts of barriers? And it's kind of like a constant struggle. Ultimately, when they get to the age where they can understand the values that underlie those sort of rules, they have to take ownership of that. But I don't think it's wise to give them a tool which is a struggle for a grown-up to prevent its manipulation of the grown-up's behavior. To give that to a child is the most irresponsible thing that a human being could do. So
yeah, and unfortunately, if I add to that, it's often a reflection of how busy we are in the modern world and the desire to have free time, right? And I'll just warn parents that desire for free time comes at a cost. Of course, we want to have some free time and we want to have a break, but unrestricted technology usage is the problem. YouTube is the enemy of a Muslim child, really. So I even want to tell parents, because even though you will play for them an Islamic cartoon, what's going to get recommended in the search engine, all these things after a few moments is going to be very unwholesome eventually. So being so mindful of saying, what can I give them that is still value driven? So just to give an example, to give your kid a video game console is better than giving them YouTube, right? Because at least it's bounded, it's closed, right? It's not going to offer them space to venture out, right? And again, it might fulfill certain other, things. But so again, the point here is you can't, even if you can't do the perfect and the ideal, your reality is that you're busy. You need to have a babysitter. You need to have some time. We live in, again, independent communities that are not communal. And again, these are bigger Omatic issues, right, that we need to solve.
Yes.
But in this individualistic world, you got to think about what is the akhaf ad-dararain, essentially. What is the lowest of the harms I can expose my kid to, right? And as a parent, again, I'll say another point. A lot of it has to do with risk tolerance. We are increasingly living in a world where people have no tolerance for the ambiguous or the uncertain or that which is risky. And so a lot of what drives the parent behavior is that I don't want my kid, right? I need to keep him in the house all the time, right? I see this all the time. The world is dangerous. He can't mingle with the world that's out there. So I'm going to keep him inside of the home and let him stay on a device. This miscalculation that somehow the safety is because he's in his bedroom or her bedroom is astronomical of a miscalculation, right? In fact, in many cases, it's far more detrimental, right, to be in your room with a device than to be outside with the neighborhood kids, right? Again, these are all things for parents to think through when they know their details. But like you mentioned, at the very minimal, trying to put these type of filters and all kinds of other issues are integral. I mean, we could go on this technology for hours. It's a
yes,
very
absolutely. It is a big challenge.
Reading is another big part here for parents. Your children will gravitate towards that which they become acclimated to. If they don't have a choice, if we allow our kids to be bored, they will find ways to keep themselves busy. If the kid is bored and the choice is technology, he will never opt into things that you want, right? So if we want and I didn't get into this earlier today, but even reading Ummatic literature, we can go into that quite a bit, but like literature that is wholesome about the Umma or anything else, most kids don't want to read anymore. And part of it is that parents have offered an alternative to reading, rather than saying, you know what, you either play, do work, or leisure reading, right? Reading is leisure, right? I mean, most of us who are academics, we love to have free time to read, of course, right? So, but setting up that type of a household where, again, it goes back to role modeling. If the parent is scrolling all day long, the kid is looking forward to his device to scroll on. If the parent is reading and the parent is engaged in Ummatic behavior in whatever way it might be, the kid is going to copy some of that, right? Which also leads me, maybe the very last point, is the need to create Ummatic content for children to engage with, right? I mean, I go back to thinking about little games as a kid or TV shows. I know in the US we had a funny game. It was called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? I don't know if you guys ever saw that in the UK. It was a TV show and a board game and a computer game. But essentially, these are just to teach you history and all kinds of, and usually it's Western history for the most part, right? And like it's a video game, it's a TV show, it's a board game. But we need to get creative about creating entertainment solutions for our kids that are rooted in who we are, right? That gives them this sense of like, whether it be in video games, by the way, right? Whether it be in board games, whether it be in any sort of products that reinforce our identity. That is really, really, really key, and a place that I hope Muslim entrepreneurs start thinking about, right? It's not only a coffee shop, right? Or a clothing store, right? Or a halal meat shop, right? The space of Muslim technology and Muslim entertainment and kind of cultural products is huge, and we have to invest in it, right?
Barakallahu feekum. I mean, this is actually, I am conscious of your time. We're coming to, we have 20 minutes before we reach the 2-hour point, but I am curious about one point you raised just now, which is the literature space, Umatic literature. But you've also, of course, opened up this entire other realm, which is, developing of various types of content. And I think I would love to hear a bit more about that if you have any particular thoughts specifically on literature The challenge with literature, as you've mentioned, is people don't read very much anymore. And so, are we thinking about Ummatic podcasts or Ummatic sort of content which will be audiobooks that will engage? Just to maybe give a bit of a personal anecdote, my children are sort of 7 and younger. And in our house, we've kind of banned YouTube and its kind of affiliates, but we use Shahid. And Shahid is basically a kind of English version of Netflix, Arabic version of Netflix in its kids setting. So it's developed by NBC. And on the whole, Arabic cartoons are a bit more healthy in their content, but nothing is ideal, obviously. So they do have access to watching that, and that will strengthen their Arabic, inshallah. There's no access to any English. But at the same time, when it comes to reading, and there are literatures out there, it's going to be increasingly difficult to persuade people to read. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, we can engineer. I wonder if you have any specific concrete tips about getting young children and teenagers to get reading more, and what you see as the future when it comes to so many of our technologies shifting into multimodal forms.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, so let's take each piece at a time. So let's come back to this issue of, you said literature. I will broaden it. I think too often people think that the child is shaped by their formal educational experiences, right? The textbooks they have in schools, and that's why so much energy goes into those things. This is actually not how most people develop a sense of who they are and their worldview. It is shaped through all these cultural forces. It is through the songs, it is through the stories, it is through the fairy tales, right? It is through the music, right? It is through all these different mediums that fall outside of formal institutions. And this is a space where we need Omatic efforts, like very, very specific. I'm talking about fiction books. Like right now, alhamdulillah, I have 4 children, I have a teenage daughter. What do you give a teenage child that's going to satisfy their curiosity, going to satisfy their linguistic, kind of like pushing them to like learn languages better, regardless of the language, by the way. In Arabic, there's low quality novels, even like, the Arab world is complaining that it's very hard. That genre is just not being well developed, right? That we have to think about. Look, we're trying to shape kids' minds. When you read a book, that whether it be, Shakespeare, right, or you read even modern stuff, fantasy stuff, all this is shaping how you think about the world. And we need ummatically minded writers to enter into the space. And it's meant to be very, very casual. It's meant to be very, very light touch to slowly, slowly shift the sentiments of a person. I mean, in my own mind, I was giving this a lot of thought. If I could go back to that idea I gave the American dream, every kid internalizes what that means if they live in America, and they aspire for it. But that has become through all kinds of different mechanisms. We need to put this Ummatic dream in our kids' hearts about a world that is ruled and governed by Islam. And they need to have some mental model about what that looks like. So are there stories, fictional stories about, all this dystopian stuff about the world is ending? What about in 100 years, someone writes a book in the year 3000 something, what's happened in the Muslim world, all the technology that's there and whatever it might be, but it's a different framing of the world for them to be like, oh, I can actually begin to imagine what these things would look like. Because right now they're just pie in the sky ideas to academics like us, right? But they need to see it in a TV show, they need to see it in a cartoon, they need to see it in a novel, they need to hear about it in a song. And these are the types of things that slowly, slowly, slowly make these realities in people's hearts before they say, you know what, that's not impossible. That's actually, like, I've grown up being surrounded by those ideas. It's very, very natural to me, right? So now we come back to literature and reading. You bring up that point. Couple of things are very important. First is devices are the enemies of reading, even if you think that they're devices for reading. Right. So for instance, reading on a tablet or a Kindle or any of these things don't work the same way actually at the neurological level as books do for numerous reasons. Right. But I will say a couple of things. So number one is the importance of having, for parents, a healthy library in the house. Very important. Actually, sometimes you can predict literacy and literacy behavior by simply the number of books that parents provide. Why? It's signaling again. If I have 5 TVs in the house, it sends a signal about the role of the television in the household, right? It has to be ubiquitous, has to be accessible, has to be everywhere. If the house is a house of literacy in books, that's everywhere. That sends a signal to the kid. Second, if the kids see the parents regularly reading, And by the way, again, the difference, if I hold up my device and I read it, usually my kid has no idea what I'm reading. You know, I'm sure all of us deal with this, use it as an excuse. My wife will say, what are you doing on your phone? And genuinely, I'm reading something that is like valuable, right? And she's like, you're always on your phone and you're browsing your phone. It's true. Even I'm doing something good, but she's skeptical of it, right? And it's true. Probably while I'm reading, my WhatsApp pops up and I scroll into my WhatsApp and these things happen. So modeling that in the household, saying we read, that's what we do in this house, right? We eat, we pray, right? We sleep, right? We read, there's certain things. That's just what we do. And so they see that, you have provided them access to it. And also, again, most importantly, you are beginning to help populate better content. I think that's the next generation's key here. Because the problem right now is that parents are saying, I don't like the literature out there. And honestly, it's better to read slightly less ideal literature than to go and sit on the device, right?
Yes.
It's really, really important, right?
Yes.
So the last thing I'll mention is the importance of having kind of these communal reading activities. You know, those of us who have studied classically, right? There's something to be said about when you sit with a teacher who reads a book. It's a different type of a suhbah and an environment, right? The style of actually having, you know, gatherings, that books are the central aspect of it, right? Our kids have to see that our world revolves around literacy and around this concept of iqra, right? They're powerful symbols, right? These symbols penetrate the soul very deeply, even if an adult may not think about it. So.
Right. Barakallahu feekum. I mean, maybe I'll just mention again a small personal anecdote, and I need to revive this with my son. I haven't done it since I've come to Qatar, but I used to lie down with him as bedtime stories. I would tell him stories of the Prophet, and I'd have the Mus'haf on my phone. I mean, fortunately, that's the easiest way to carry it while you're lying down. And we would basically scour verses of the Quran which relayed a story. You know, they loved the story of the Prophet Isa, the story of the Prophet Adam alayhi salam, etc., Nuh alayhi salam. And we would take these sorts of stories and I would read the Quranic verse to them, you know, with a nice recitation. And then I would translate its meaning and then tell the broader story, because the Quran, of course, is giving kind of like what the teacher of my teacher, Sheikh Abul Hasan al-Nadwi, did in his Qasas al-Nabiyyin,
of course, beautiful.
Which is a very beautiful model for how to sort of teach children Arabic and also connect them to the Quranic stories. So I think, you know, these are efforts. I need to revive that in my own personal life. But and recently we attended the Ma'arid. There was a nice book fair, and we bought a few books which are prophetic stories that are designed for children. So I think in languages like Arabic there are very beneficial sort of tools, but as you say, this is an Ummatic challenge, and we need this in every language. So with that, I really appreciate the. Maybe I'll just throw in a comment from one of our listeners before we conclude. Someone saying storytelling and reading to children is essential to create readers. We need literature that gives young people hope and through which they are able to valorize Islamic heroes and Muslim achievements. Absolutely. And I think this is precisely what Dr. Osman was talking about. With that, I really appreciate your time and your stamina to go on for 2 hours like that. And you know, I've just been enjoying myself because I throw in a couple of questions and then you're getting on with the discussion. Jazakumullah khairan. Really, I'm grateful for you to join us, and I'm sure we'll have more of you in the not too distant future. And Jazakumullah khairan. With that, I also want to thank the Ummatics team behind the scenes, Sister Ilham, and all of the people who've given their questions and put their comments in the chat. And we look forward to seeing you in a month's time for our next colloquium, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Until then, stay Ummatic, and please remember us in your du'as. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.